ArtSpark's classic antique glaze, how to turn ordinary objects into family heirlooms. This tutorial is to demonstrate the classic antique glaze. It's an ideal glaze to be used on objects or furniture, even gilded surfaces like imitation gold or silver leaf. This object that we're using here is quite ornamental, so it'll really accentuate the profiles of what an antique glaze can offer. The first step is to apply a primer sealer over this raw plaster. A water-based acrylic primer, standard you get from your Home Depot or local paint supply store, will work fine. I'm going to take a brush and I'm just going to work it into the recesses and crevices here to get a nice even coating. Once this is complete, we'll allow it to dry fully before we can put on the base color. Now my primer is completely dry. I'm going to apply the base color, and you could use a couple different colors. I prefer to use an off-white, like a white dove or linen white, something that has a little bit of creaminess to it, but essentially is white. And I also use an eggshell finish, because I find that on glaze treatments, eggshell tends to work the best. It holds on to the glaze. If it's a gloss, it'll be a little too slick, and if it's a flat finish, it can take the glaze a little bit irregularly, as if it's absorbing it. So this color is not too different from the primer, but it will certainly give it a little bit of a tone, and an additional layer of paint also builds up the body of the piece to give it a little bit more form and integrity for the subsequent glaze application. So I'm going to do the same thing here, as you see. Working in the recesses, allow this to dry fully, and then I'll have a slightly off-white finished painted piece in order to accept my final glaze treatment. All these tutorials are available at www.artsparks.com. You can also see recommendations on color. There's an extensive color palette that shows you base color options in glaze colors, anywhere from Tuscan treatments to English country to French to early American, whatever color tone you might be looking for your particular project. Here's the fun part, mixing up the glaze. Now I've got my tools here in a paper palette here. Got some rags. I've got two different brushes. One is to apply the glaze. The other one is to pounce it out and to soften the glaze. I'll keep this one dry. And then I have my three colors. Now for classic antique glaze, I use the raw umber, I use burnt sienna, I use Van Dyke brown. In this case I'm using acrylic artist colors. You could also use oil paint in tubes or universal tinters depending on your project. And I also will mix in various extenders depending on the size of the project. So for this small object, I can just use these three paints, mixing up a little bit of water to dilute it to make the glaze consistency that I want, and then apply it to the surface. If I was using a larger surface, flat or ornamental, I might add some Floetrol, which is a latex extender, Artist Acrylic Glazing Liquid, which is a traditional faux finishing acrylic glaze. I might even add a little bit of varnish, clear varnish, to harden the surface and facilitate the drying time. So I'm going to take a little bit of these paints. Here's my raw umber. Spread a little bit on the palette here. Now, I don't need much because it's a small object. Now you can also mix this up in a larger container, so you have a master glaze for larger surfaces, and then from that master glaze, once you get the consistency proper, you can then add it to a smaller container and add some water or glazing liquid to extend it, and then you would work from that secondary pot and always have the master glaze remain as it is. So that's your primary glaze, or where you'll be using your glazing from. Now I got a brush a little bit wet with water. I'm going to start taking the color out. That's raw umber. The proportions vary depending on what you're doing and the color tones that you want, but essentially it's about a 3% raw umber to about a 2% or 1% burnt sienna and a little bit of Van Dyke brown. You can see that color there. Now it's a little bit red, so I'm going to add a little bit more Van Dyke brown, raw umber to this to get to a nice brown consistency. Now that's my glaze. It's quite thick right now, so before I apply it, I'm going to want to add a little bit more water to to make it much more fluid, so it really becomes transparent. And a glaze essentially is just that. It's a thinned out or transparent color of your choice that's flowed over a surface and then antiqued or brushed off depending on the surface that you're working on. One thing I like to do when I'm antiquing is to saturate the surface first with water. Now on a small object like this it's not as important, but on larger surfaces, whether it's furniture or walls, it facilitates the glaze to move around the surface without drying out too quickly or saturating the surface in an area you may not want it to. So I'll begin that process by just brushing over water really loosely. Doesn't really matter, just kind of cover it. Okay, so now that I've got a nice little coverage of water, can do my antique here. Now, nice and fluid. Now it's a little thick there. I'm going to dilute it a little bit. Now, beauty too is that you can always dilute it. So I'm just going to coat it on here like so. Make it a little teeny bit thicker. And just work that brush all over it. Get it in that recesses and so forth. All around the surface. Now a little varnish in there will make it a little bit less bubbly and so forth. Now it's already starting to dry. So the next thing I want to do is I want to take my dry brush, put that right there, keep a rag handy. So you want to keep the bristle, and I'm going to just float and move it all around, kind of get a nice coverage, get rid of some of the excess glaze here. Good coverage. Now I'm going to take my rag and I'm going to wipe off the high points. Now a key thing to think about when you're antiquing is really what you're trying to mimic, and you're trying to mimic what would happen over time. So say for example this had a nice pristine bracket here that was on your wall, and over time it sat there and collected dust, and people would come and clean it and spray it. So when you're cleaning it, really what you're doing is you're really just getting the high points. It's very difficult to get in low points, so the high points end up staying polished while the dirt stays in the recesses. So that's what we're trying to mimic here. Take that dry brush again, move it around, move that excess glaze, so forth. You can already start seeing the way the profiles are being accentuated here. Again, put that down. I'm going to wipe it again. Now my glaze is also starting to set up. It's drying, so you have a finite time to work it, but having said that, you also have the ability to kind of really move it around, lift it up a little bit so I can get it all. Now if I want to get some of those peaks in there, I'm going to keep doing this as my glaze sets up. Okay, dry brush once again. Get it out so there's not a large amount of pooling in the recess, but enough to keep the idea that dust had settled over time. And again, you're managing it while it's starting to dry. So I might actually move my brush in the direction of the object. So I'm going up and down a little bit, so I start to get a little bit of a streakiness, or what we would call striae here. Okay. Again with the dry brush, the dry rag. Going to go over the high points. Now you can really start buffing it out. And every time you do that, you get rid of a little bit of excess glaze. And at the same time, you keep all those dark colors in your recesses. It's a nice high point there. Now if I get these areas in here, then those accentuate, again, the profile of the piece, keeping it nice and architectural. And I have the ability to kind of choose a little bit of how I want my antique to be. Like that. Take my dry brush once again. And move that glaze around. Now I can also play around with the density of the glaze. If I want it to be really old world, kind of crunchy looking, I might add a little bit more thicker glaze to it so the darker areas stay really dark, lighter areas are not so much. Or if I want a really soft glaze look, like say antiqued ivory, I might put a little thinner glaze on there so that way it really becomes a pale wash over it, and those profiles, though they're accentuated, not nearly as much. So now I'm almost to the point where I like it. And there. And I'm going to take it one last time with the rag, buff up the high points again. See how that's coming out nicely there. Here, some nice detail right in the center there. I'm going to pull out this acanthus leaf down here with the floral portion of this wall bracket. Now these brackets and many others are also available at artsparks.com. So you can order them to purchase unfinished, try them out yourself, make great gifts. Great for your starting off an antique shop. Good little product to start with. Okay, now if you find that it's a little bit not coming off quite how you want, not a problem. So I want a little bit more highlights. I dip my rag in a little bit of water like that, and then I can take off that glaze a little bit more, just to really have my darks and lights jump up at me like so. Let's work this area in here a little bit. It's a nice detail up here, so I'm going to try to really push that one. Now adding Floetrol or acrylic glazing medium lets you kind of extend this time a little bit, so you don't have to work quite as fast, and that's obviously why it works particularly well on larger surfaces or furniture pieces particularly. Let's do that area on top there. And if you find that it's gone a little too pale, let it dry out, add a little bit more glaze, and then you're done with it. So I'm going to just take a little bit more off in here, and there, and there. Now there are further antiquing methods, which we'll explain in other tutorials. One of them is called fly specks, which actually mimic what flies would be over time, and that's by spattering, taking a fine mist of little teeny black or dark raw umber specks. There's also rotten stone, which is a fine gray powder. It gives you that powdery look as if this piece had been sitting in an antique shop for years and years and years. You made that perfect find. So there's our antique wall bracket, like so. And there we have our antique process with our classic antique glaze. Visit us again at www.artsparks.com for more tutorials.